I shall now make a statement in my capacity as Secretary of State of the United States. And I thank you for the opportunity to address the Security Council. According to UN Security Council Resolution 2321, a stated objective of this Council is North Korea's abandonment of its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs. For the past 20 years, well-intentioned diplomatic efforts to halt these programs have failed. It is only by first dismantling them that there can be peace, stability, and economic prosperity for all of Northeast Asia. With each successive detonation and missile test, North Korea pushes Northeast Asia and the world closer to instability and broader conflict. The threat of a North Korean nuclear attack on Seoul or Tokyo is real, and it is likely only a matter of time before North Korea develops the capability to strike the U.S. mainland. Indeed, the DPRK has repeatedly claimed it plans to conduct such a strike. Given that rhetoric, the United States cannot idly stand by, nor can other members of this Council who are within striking distance of North Korean missiles. Having for years displayed a pattern of behavior that defies multiple UN Security Council resolutions, including 2321 and 2270, and erodes global progress on nuclear nonproliferation, there's no reason to think that North Korea will change its behavior under the current multilateral sanctions framework. For too long, the international community has been reactive in addressing North Korea. Those days must come to an end. Failing to act now on the most pressing security issue in the world may bring catastrophic consequences. We have said this before, and it bears repeating. The policy of strategic patience is over. Additional patience will only mean acceptance of a nuclear North Korea. The more we bide our time, the sooner we will run out of it. In light of the growing threat, the time has come for all of us to put new pressure on North Korea to abandon its dangerous path. I urge this Council to act before North Korea does. We must work together to adopt a new approach and impose increased diplomatic and economic pressures on the North Korean regime. The new campaign the United States is embarking on is driven by our own national security considerations, and it is welcomed by many nations who are concerned for their own security and question why North Korea clings to nuclear capabilities for which it has no need. Our goal is not regime change, nor do we desire to threaten the North Korean people or destabilize the Asia-Pacific region. Over the years, we have withdrawn our own nuclear weapons from South Korea and offered aid to North Korea as proof of our intent to de-escalate the situation and normalize relations. Since 1995, the United States has provided over $1.3 billion in aid to North Korea, and we look forward to resuming our contributions once the DPRK begins to dismantle its nuclear weapons and missile technology programs. The DPRK, for its own sake, must dismantle its nuclear missile programs if it wants to achieve the security, economic development, and international recognition that it seeks. North Korea must understand that respect will never follow recklessness. North Korea must take concrete steps to reduce the threat that its illegal weapons programs pose to the United States and our allies before we can even consider talks. I propose all nations take these three actions beginning today. First, we call on UN member states to fully implement the commitments they have made regarding North Korea. This includes all measures required in Resolutions 2321 and 2270. Those nations which have not fully enforced these resolutions fully discredit this body. Second, we call on countries to suspend or downgrade diplomatic relations with North Korea. North Korea exploits its diplomatic privileges to fund its illicit nuclear and missile technology programs, and constraining its diplomatic activity will cut off a flow of needed resources. In light of North Korea's recent actions, normal relations with the DPRK are simply not acceptable. Third, We must increase North Korea's financial isolation. We must levy new sanctions on DPRK entities and individuals supporting its weapons and missile programs and tighten those that are already in place. The United States also would much prefer countries and people in question to own up to their lapses and correct their behavior themselves. But we will not hesitate to sanction third country entities and individuals supporting the DPRK's illegal activities. We must bring maximum economic pressure by severing trade relationships that directly fund the DPRK's nuclear and missile program. I call on the international community to suspend the flow of North Korean guest workers and to impose bans on North Korean imports, especially coal. We must all do our share, but China, accounting for 90% of North Korean trade, China alone has economic leverage over Pyongyang that is unique, and its role is therefore particularly important. The U.S. and China have held very productive exchanges on this issue, and we look forward to further actions that build on what China has already done. Lastly, as we have said before, all options for responding to future provocation must remain on the table. Diplomatic and financial levers of power will be backed up by a willingness to counteract North Korean aggression with military action, if necessary. We much prefer a negotiated solution to this problem, but we are committed to defending ourselves and our allies against North Korean aggression. This new pressure campaign will be swiftly implemented and painful to North Korean interest. I realize some nations for which a relationship with North Korea has been in some ways a net positive may be disinclined to implement the measures of pressure on North Korea. But the catastrophic effects of a North Korean nuclear strike outweigh any economic benefits. We must be willing to face the hard truths and make hard choices right now to prevent disastrous outcomes in the future. Business as usual is not an option. There's also a moral dimension to this problem. Countries must know by now that helping the North Korean regime means enabling cruelty and suffering. North Korea feeds billions of dollars into a nuclear program it does not need, while its own people starve. The regime's pursuit of nuclear weapons does not serve its own national security or the well-being of a people trapped in tyranny. I ask the community of nations to help us preserve security and protect human dignity. In one of my first trips as America's Secretary of State, I looked across the DMZ at the haunted land of North Korea. Beyond the border is a nation of sorrow, frozen in time. While the world sees the gleaming buildings of Pyongyang, the blight of oppression and starvation has swept this land for over 60 years. But even though the present condition of that country is bleak, the United States believes in a future for North Korea. These first steps toward a more hopeful future will happen most quickly if other stakeholders in the region and the global security join us. For years, North Korea has been dictating the terms of its dangerous course of action. It is time for us to retake control of the situation. We ask the members of this Council and all other partners to implement a new strategy to denuclearize North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here this afternoon. Sorry to be a little bit late coming over from the UN building, but I'm really happy that you are all able to come and listen to this afternoon to a brief readout of what we've been doing today over at the UN building. Of course, today we had Secretary Tillerson in town for ministerial level UN Security Council meeting. This month is the U.S. presidency of the Security Council, and we convened the first ever ministerial level Security Council meeting on the issue of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We had a very good discussion this morning in the Council. I'm sure some of you have already seen some of the remarks that were mentioned, but I would characterize that conversation as really reflecting a broad consensus among the entire council about the seriousness of the threat posed by the nuclear and missile programs in North Korea, the frustration on the part of the council over the repeated violations of UN Security Council resolutions about this issue, and a resolve to sort of address the issue, step up the pressure, and really try to make a concerted and united effort to get the North Korean regime to change its mind about its weapons programs and come to the table and be prepared to talk about denuclearization. So I think the Secretary had a number of meetings in addition to the Council meeting. He met in trilateral format with the Japanese Foreign Minister Kishida and the Korean Foreign Minister Yoon this morning before the Council session to discuss further our trilateral cooperation with respect to the North Korean issue. And then after the session this afternoon, he had a bilateral meeting with Foreign Minister Wang Yi of China to discuss how to go about the approach on keeping up the pressure on North Korea and pursuing a strategy of cooperation going forward to bring about some kind of resolution to this issue. The Secretary had a number of other bilateral meetings, and he's been doing outreach to foreign ministers around the globe in the run-up to this meeting today to try to solicit and coordinate our international effort to step up the pressure on this issue, which is frankly becoming very quickly the #1 national security priority for the Trump administration. So with that, I'll just offer those brief opening remarks and then be happy to take a couple of questions. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm sorry about that, but I'm happy to do what I can here this afternoon. So I'm gonna,
Thank you. My name is Masatoshi Nagata with Kyoto News, Japan. Could you tell us what exactly the Chinese are saying in case of something extraordinary happens in North Korea? And what kind of specific measures are they willing to take? And also, do you think the possibility of major conflict is over for now, or is it approaching?
Yeah, thank you. So I think on the issue of what the Chinese would be willing to do should there be another major provocation, and I take it that was what you meant by the first part of your question. The Chinese have been pretty clear, and I think Secretary Tillerson even spoke about it a bit yesterday in some of the media coverage that he had, that they've been signaling clearly to the North Koreans that they will be willing to take additional significant measures in the event of a further provocation. And by that, I think we mean probably another nuclear test. They've already done 5 of those, and there's some talk that there might be a 6th nuclear test. That would be a major provocation. Also, the potential for an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile launch, would be another category of major provocation. And I think the Chinese have been reaching out, talking to the North Koreans, explaining to them that there would be very serious consequences, both from the UN angle with regard to additional UN Security Council resolutions that would come in the wake of such an event, but also unilateral measures that China would take. They have not been specific about what they would be willing to do, but they have indicated to us that they would be serious measures. And so far, I think we feel that whatever we've been able to do, whatever China's been able to do with North Korea, at least for this recent period of anniversaries in North Korea, they have not conducted a major provocation. So we're not drawing any major conclusions from that, but that's at least not bad news. On the second part, major confrontation, I know the President had some comments on this. I mean, certainly the consensus at the Council today was that everybody understands that it's preferable to resolve this challenge peacefully. And that is what the Secretary and his colleagues today at the Council were talking about, our resolve to do. We don't want to take any options off the table because this has become an urgent threat. And time is running out. We've spent a lot of time over the past several decades working on this problem, and we can't keep working on it for several more decades. We don't have that kind of time. So I think we're working on how to solve this peacefully. That's why we're talking about this pressure campaign that will change the calculus of the regime in North Korea and convince them to come to the table, make a serious effort at discussing with the rest of the international community the denuclearization program. So I think that's what we're after. We'll see how it goes.
Thank you. Manic Matter syndicated. There seems to be a lot of confusion on the deployment of THAAD in South Korea. The president made some remarks in an interview with Reuters demanding or asking for $1 billion from Seoul, and Seoul responded immediately saying this is not going to happen. So could you give us an update on that, please?
Sure. So, I mean, I don't know if I would call it confusion, but it is true that the president is very serious about burden sharing with allies with whom we have military partnerships. And so I think when he thinks about all kinds of deployments around the world, and you've heard him also on the subject of NATO members, you know, not paying up to the required percentage of their GDP that they're required to pay into NATO for their defense budgets. I think this is another case where, you know, the president just wants to be sure that we're doing the kind of burden sharing in our alliances in Asia and in our alliance with South Korea that, you know, he thinks is fair and equitable. Of course, we all know that the South Koreans are a really a bedrock ally. They do step up and do an awful lot. They pay 2.7% of their GDP into their defense budget, so they're quite a bit above a number of our other partners. And I think the president does realize that they have also contributed to burden sharing on the THAAD deployment. So I think he's just looking to make sure that the U.S. is getting kind of the equitable treatment and burden sharing out of the alliance. But I think on the THAAD deployment, you know, he recognizes that we've already done discussions on burden sharing, that the ROK has contributed to that deployment, and that they are a very solid ally when it comes to burden sharing and in sort of stepping up and being right with us there in the alliance.
My name is Tanaka from NHK. I'm asking about today's meeting between One China. Can you elaborate more? What did secretaries ask specific measures for China to take regarding DPRK?
Well, you know, this conversation followed on a number of other conversations that we've had with the Chinese, both in bilateral format and multilateral format. We had the multilateral council session. There was a multilateral lunch session at which North Korea was also discussed among the same group that was in the council session. And then he had the bilateral meeting with the foreign minister, with Foreign Minister Wong after that. So it was a long conversation in three parts, I would say, and among those three parts there was quite a lot of discussion of both general approaches and also sort of a more detailed or sort of granular sequencing and roadmap of things we would expect to see, you know, over the coming months on the issue of North Korea, on the issue of international cooperation, and also on the issue of China's contribution to that cooperation. I don't think I want to get into the details of the private conversation, but there are very specific things that we've been discussing, both that China could do, you know, with North Korea to try to test their, you know, whether or not they've come to some kind of change of heart over the seriousness with which they would approach a discussion about denuclearization, but also on issues that they would pursue if in the case of another provocation or in the effort to step up pressure. So those discussions are ongoing.
Guillermo Fesser from El Intermedios TV news show in Spain. So Secretary of State has pointed to nations that he said have not fully enforced the UN resolutions against Korea, and said that the U.S. won't hesitate to sanction those third countries. I would like to know which countries does the Secretary of State have in mind, and would those countries be considered enemies in case that the military action is considered? I mean, are we talking of one enemy, North Korea, or are we talking of a mingled situation in the world?
Yeah. So I don't think he was having in mind a very specific list of countries when he says everybody has obligations to fully enforce the UN Security Council resolutions. We all know that in its efforts to circumvent sanctions and other kinds of restrictions put on its economy, the North Korean networks are quite well established in very underground ways that are hard to detect, are hard for countries to stop sometimes. And there was discussion at the Council this morning about the need to help countries build up their capacity to detect these kinds of underground networks that are maybe fueling and financing the weapons programs in North Korea. So I don't think he had any particular countries in mind on that list, but we do know that the North Koreans are getting around the sanctions because some countries are not able to or willing to put the resources in to catch all of those transgressions. So I think that's what he meant. And that if we can't get satisfaction, if we bring information about some of these networks to a country, if we can't get it resolved, by burden sharing and sharing cooperation and information, that we would have to take other steps to stop those financial flows from getting to the North Koreans so that they can use them to further their weapons programs. And that's what he meant by the imposing our own national measures on those companies.
Thank you. I'm Eugene Newell from Kyoto News. And I want to ask about from China's voice. Chinese foreign minister proposed a restart of six-party talk today. But I see the Secretary Tillerson didn't mention the restart of a six-party talk. And U.S. stance is very different from the Chinese stance. So how do you fulfill the differences among them?
Yeah, it's going to be hard for me to speak for the Chinese and their position, but what I think you're getting at is that there was a lot of talk on the part of the Chinese delegation about dialogue and the need to try to get the North Koreans back to the negotiating table. What Secretary Tillerson has said is, we want to solve this diplomatically, we want to solve this peacefully, but we have not detected any seriousness on the part of the North Korean regime about coming to the table to discuss a negotiated solution and denuclearization or abandonment of their weapons programs. And so I think we're looking for some signal of seriousness that would lead us to think it would be worth having these kinds of talks. Whereas on the Chinese side, I think they are more looking further down the road at the peaceful resolution and how we will get to talks. And so there's a little bit of a difference in emphasis there. I don't think the Chinese are particularly wedded to one format for the talks or another. They're just looking down the road to how we'll get to talks, and we are looking at the near term about how we can tell whether or not the North Koreans are serious about the talks, because for us that's the main point.
We have time, I think, for just one last question.
This guy's had his hand up for a long time. Yeah.
Do it after, because I have to let the foreign media first.
Okay.
US media.
Okay, I'll get you later.
Give it
Last one?
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. Alexandra McInerney from the Tokyo Shimbun. Just to follow up on what you're saying right now, what practically would you consider a signal of that seriousness? So what would you like to see from North Korea to show that they are ready to come back to negotiations and taking it seriously?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think we'll know it when we see it. If there's a big provocation, then we'll also know that that's not the answer we were looking for, okay? All right, thank you all very much. It's great to be here with you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk with everyone.
Thank you so much for coming today. Just to reiterate, this briefing was on the record, and we will send out a transcript as soon as it is available. And the video and audio will also be up as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
I shall now make a further statement in my capacity as Secretary of State of the United States. First, I appreciate all of the statements that have been made by you, and I have received those statements in the constructive spirit in which I know they've been offered. I also want to acknowledge the presence of a large number of ambassadors with us today. Your presence gives strength to the importance of this issue and is a visible demonstration of the importance of this issue to the international community, and I welcome you and I appreciate you being here. As has been stressed repeatedly in many of your statements today, North Korea has failed to honor its commitments of the past. It is making promises which it has broken. Had this body fully enforced and stood behind resolutions it had enacted in the past, vigorously enforcing sanctions with full compliance, perhaps we would not have found ourselves confronted with the high level of tension that we're faced today. We will not negotiate our way back to the negotiating table with North Korea. We will not reward their violations of past resolutions. We will not reward their bad behavior with talks. We will only engage in talks with North Korea when they exhibit a good faith commitment to abiding by the Security Council resolutions and their past promises to end their nuclear programs. And that is why we must have full and complete compliance by every country to the resolutions that have been enacted by this body in the past. No relaxation in the vigorous implementation of sanctions. And we have called for those sanctions to be extended to other areas as well on a voluntary basis, and we're calling globally for all countries to participate in exerting pressure on North Korea. This is the way you make your voice heard, is through action. Any failure to take action diminishes your vote for these resolutions of the past, it diminishes your vote for future resolutions, and it devalues your seat at this council. We must have full, complete compliance by all members of the council. I thank you.